"I have to find out, Marie. I have to end this. I can't keep going like this. I still love you, even if you don't love me anymore. Please take care of Lucy. And if you wake up at 3:33 a.m., whatever you do, don't look outside." That was the note my husband left behind. The note he wrote before disappearing. He just walked out in the middle of the night and never came back. The front door was left wide open, his car still in the driveway, his clothes untouched in the closet. He even left behind his toothbrush. I guess I should start from the beginning, though it's hard to pinpoint exactly when that was. Liam and I had been married for almost 8 years, but we'd been having problems for more than half of that time. After our daughter was born, our intimacy faded, and things started unraveling from there. We could never quite sync up, and every little issue would escalate into a huge argument. When unresolved frustrations don't dissipate, they simmer beneath the surface, and both of us were guilty of boiling over at the slightest provocation. Eventually, it became easier to avoid each other. We split the household tasks. He cooked, I cleaned, and the only time we were together was while we slept. One morning, I woke up to find him sitting up in bed, propped against the headboard, staring blankly into space. Normally, Liam would be up and out of bed the moment he woke, always active, maybe because of his job or his love for outdoor activities. He had always been a morning person. When he realized I was awake, he snapped out of whatever thoughts had him so lost. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Just tired," he said, stretching dramatically like a bear coming out of hibernation, making a point of it. He got out of bed and paused for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to say more. As he pulled on his clothes, his voice took on an overly casual tone. "Woke up in the middle of the night, checked the clock, tossed and turned for what felt like hours. But when I looked at the time again, it hadn't changed." "You probably misread the clock the first time," I mumbled, yawning and rolling over. I could hear him muttering to himself as he put on his socks, something about how I never believed him. If my eyes had been open, I would have rolled them. The rest of that day was completely normal. He took Lucy to school, went to work, and I might have forgotten about the whole thing entirely. But that night, after we'd gone to bed, I was startled awake by a thud in the middle of the night. Barely visible in the dim light, seeping through the curtains, I saw Liam standing at the foot of the bed. I rubbed my eyes and sat up. "What are you doing?" I asked. "My phone's not working," he grumbled. "Keep it down. You'll wake Lucy," I whispered harshly. "First the clock freezes, now my phone won't turn on," he complained, though a bit quieter this time. I glanced toward the floor, noticing a faint rectangle of light reflecting off the carpet. "It's working now." Liam stopped pacing and turned around. He bent down to pick up the phone, and its bright screen lit up his face, which was contorted in confusion. Guess I knocked some sense into it. Using the phone's screen as a light, he walked out toward the bathroom. "The clock definitely needs new batteries, though," he added in a low voice. Curious, I leaned over to his side of the bed and grabbed the alarm clock. The digital display glowed with large red numbers, 3:34 a.m. As I stared at it through the darkness, it flickered to 3:35. Seemed fine to me. I rolled back over and went to sleep. It was my turn to take Lucy to school the next morning. And while I got her ready, Liam made breakfast. Apparently, he had woken her up the night before with his phone fiasco, and he must have felt bad about it, because he made pancakes. They were Lucy's favorite, probably from some movie she'd seen. And despite Liam's usual protests that, "We're not Americans, we don't eat pancakes for breakfast," he knew they were an easy way to make her happy. Say what you will about my husband, but he loved our daughter. He didn't always go out of his way to make her smile, but when it counted, he tried. But the following morning, he was in a foul mood. "Oh, now she's awake," he muttered sarcastically as I walked into the kitchen, tying my robe. I chose to ignore the comment. It wasn't like I'd slept in late or anything, and besides, it was the weekend. I braced myself for a tense, silent breakfast. But as I approached the counter, my eyes landed on his phone. The screen cracked and spiderwebbed with hairline fractures. "What happened to your phone?" "It stopped working again," he said, rustling his newspaper. "Tried knocking some sense into it like last time, but this time I hit it too hard, apparently." Well, that was stupid, I said plainly as I turned on the kettle. Liam didn't respond. Instead, he folded up his newspaper, tossed back the last of his coffee, and left the room. I figured he was more upset with himself than with me. If he'd been mad at me, he would have thrown a comment my way. He always liked having the last word. His tone softened, though, when he ran into Lucy in the hallway. "Morning, darling. I didn't wake you up again last night, did I?" "No, Daddy." I did find it odd that he'd managed to smash his phone without waking either of us, but those thoughts were quickly drowned out by how absurd the whole situation was. We were both already in bad moods, so we avoided each other as much as possible. Weekends always made that harder, though, and by the time we went to bed that night, we couldn't help but argue. "What's that?" I asked as I saw him tuck something under his pillow. "It's a torch." I couldn't help but laugh. "Why on earth do you need a torch?" "To see where I'm going in the middle of the night, in case I wake up again." "Well, maybe if you didn't lose your temper, you'd still have your phone to guide you. Maybe if you stopped criticizing me constantly, I wouldn't get angry so easily." And just like that, we spiraled into another argument that quickly got personal. We both ended up turning away from each other in bed, backs facing one another. It's funny how when you're mad, even the smallest things can irritate you. The way they breathe, the way they pull on the covers. Eventually, Liam started snoring. I wasn't far behind. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. I assumed he was still upset, but when I found him, he seemed oddly detached from the whole situation. He stood in the living room, staring up at the clock above the fireplace, a pile of watches and alarm clocks clutched in his arms. The news was playing on the muted TV in the background. "Hey!" he called out as soon as I walked in. He actually sounded happy to see me. "Can I borrow your phone for a second?" What are you doing?" I asked, still groggy. "What time is it?" I told him, and when he frowned in disbelief, I showed him my phone. "They can't all be wrong," he muttered under his breath, setting the clocks down on the mantelpiece one by one. He left the alarm clock for last, holding it up in both hands like it was some kind of artifact. "Liam, what are you doing?" I asked, rubbing my eyes and grabbing my pink watch from his pile. "There was a power cut last night," he said. "I think it's been happening every night. Even my torch wouldn't work." I shrugged. "The clocks have batteries, Liam. A power cut wouldn't affect them." "You're not getting it," he said, clearly frustrated. "Even my torch didn't work, nothing worked. That's why my phone wouldn't turn on. I tried yours too, but it was dead. Everything was off. No lights, no fridge, no watches. The only thing that stayed on was this clock." He held up the alarm clock again as if to emphasize its importance. And it was stuck at 3:33 a.m. "Are you sure this wasn't a dream?" I asked. "It wasn't a bloody dream," he snapped. "Okay, so there was a power cut," I said, already making my way toward the kitchen. "Do you want some tea?" "It wasn't just that," he said, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "I was awake for at least an hour. Nothing worked the entire time, and the clock stayed at 3:33. Then, suddenly, everything came back on, and the clock changed to 3:34. "So, what are you saying?" I asked, genuinely confused. He gestured wildly at the television, pointing to the small timer at the bottom of the screen, then held up the alarm clock for comparison. They were perfectly synchronized. How is that possible? Where did that time go? His movements were so frantic, it looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. "Liam, it was probably just a power cut," I said, exasperated. "Call the electric company if you're worried. I'm going to make some tea." "It wasn't a fucking dream," I heard him mutter as he knelt in front of the TV, holding the alarm clock up to the screen as if searching for answers. That was when his obsession began. At least he was tolerable that day. I could tell it was eating at him, but he didn't bring it up again. Not until he woke me later that night. It was the thud that woke me, more than anything, though the whimpering was what made me sit up straight in bed. "What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?" Liam's voice came from the foot of the bed. In the faint moonlight, filtering through the curtains, I could barely make out his shape, scrambling backward across the floor. His wide, terrified eyes glinted as he kicked himself away from the window, shaking his head as if trying to deny what he'd seen. As I got out of bed and walked over to him, Liam flinched and looked up at me. Even in the dim light, the terror on his face was unmistakable. I'd never seen him like this before. "There's someone outside," he whispered frantically. "Someone in a mask." They saw me. They looked right at me. I frowned and moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. Our street was as it always was, quiet, with a few parked cars, streetlights casting their usual glow, and the houses across the way. I scanned the area, searching for anyone or anything unusual, but saw nothing. "There's nobody out there," I said, letting the curtain fall back into place. Liam scrambled to his feet and shoved the curtain aside, pressing his face and hands against the glass. His eyes darted back and forth as he scoured the empty street. "I saw someone," he muttered, still breathless. "I know I did." I climbed back into bed, glancing at the clock on his bedside table. It read 3:35 a.m. The next morning, it was my turn to take Lucy to school, and I didn't see much of Liam throughout the day, though I hadn't gone out of my way to avoid him. Later that evening, I found him installing extra locks on the doors, a deadbolt on both the front and back. I bit my tongue, holding back the urge to say something that might spark another fight. Maybe he did see someone, and maybe, just maybe, it was a good idea to be a little more cautious. After all, what if someone really had been out there? Someone with bad intentions? That night, I stirred to find the bed empty. I glanced around the room, but Liam was nowhere to be seen. Since I was already awake, I decided to head to the bathroom. As I stepped onto the landing, I bumped into him, walking up the stairs. Even in the dim light, I could see him trying to hide something behind his back. "What's that?" I asked before he could say anything. "Nothing," he muttered. I took a step down, craning my neck to get a better look, but before I could, he grabbed my arm with his free hand. "Go to bed," he hissed. "What are you hiding? Is that a crowbar?" I asked, incredulous. "It's nothing," he said, but he no longer bothered trying to hide it. He lowered his arm, and sure enough, the crowbar glinted in the faint light. "Go back to bed." "Fucking psycho," I muttered, stepping away from him in disbelief. "Well, it's a good thing I had it. Someone was trying to get in. I must have scared them off," he said, his voice low and firm. "What? Someone tried to break in?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Yeah, they were messing with the handle. I could hear it." I'd hoped that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. His fixation only worsened. Liam became even more irritable, snapping over the smallest things. It was obvious he wasn't sleeping well. If I hadn't been the one pushing him, he probably wouldn't have gone to work at all. And I certainly wasn't getting any thanks for it. Instead, I became the target of his frustration. Somehow, in his mind, I was to blame for everything. I didn't believe him. I wasn't helping. "Then wake me up if it's so bad," I snapped one day, fed up. "Don't you think I've tried?" he shot back. "I've shaken you, slapped you, but you won't wake up until it's over. Until he's gone." "Until who is gone?" I asked cautiously, trying to process what he'd just said. He'd slapped me? My hand instinctively went to my cheek. Surely I'd know if my husband had slapped me in my sleep. Wouldn't there be a mark, a bruise? Liam wasn't a small guy. But then again, it wasn't like him to hurt me. He could be a jerk sometimes, but he'd never been violent. "Forget it," he muttered, dismissing me. That night I was jolted awake by the alarm's loud beeping. As I reached to turn it off, Liam's hand beat me to it, silencing the noise. He was fully dressed, standing beside the bed, with the crowbar in hand. What time is it?" I mumbled, still groggy. "You told me to wake you up. I can't once it starts, but maybe it'll work if you're awake before," he said, walking over to the window. He cracked the curtain open with the crowbar, peering outside. "For God's sake, Liam," I muttered, but I got up anyway. If this was what it took to make him stop, maybe it was worth it. I found myself longing for the old Liam, the one who wasn't consumed by paranoia. This new version of him made me realize how good things used to be. The clock on the bedside table read 3:32 a.m. I walked over to the other side of the curtain and pulled it open, staring out into the quiet street. The usual scene greeted me: dim streetlights, parked cars, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I could hear the faint hum of a distant car speeding along a nearby road, though it was out of sight. "So, what exactly am I supposed to be looking for?" I asked, tired of this game. Liam didn't respond. I kept my gaze on the street, waiting for something, anything to happen. After a few minutes, I shook my head, feeling ridiculous. I turned away from the window to speak to him, but he wasn't there. I scanned the room, my heart racing. Liam was nowhere to be found, and I hadn't even heard him leave. I glanced at the clock. It was now 3:38 a.m. Afraid, powerless. It's easy to forget how much we rely on electricity until a power cut hits, reminding us just how vulnerable we are. "Liam," I whispered, not wanting to wake Lucy. She was still sleeping soundly, at least for now, and I hoped she could stay that way until morning. I made my way through the kitchen, using my hands to feel my way around the cabinets and counters to avoid crashing into anything. "Liam?" I called again, a little louder this time, though the fear in my voice was creeping in. Strangely, the thought that haunted me the most wasn't the darkness or the silence, but the idea that Liam, in a confused state, might attack me with that stupid crowbar, thinking I was an intruder. Still no response. Was he asleep? The irony wasn't lost on me, that he might finally be sleeping through the first power cut I'd been awake for. In the dim light, I could just make out his silhouette sitting on the sofa, his back turned to me. My eyes were adjusting, and as I moved around the couch, I saw that Liam was indeed awake, staring straight ahead. His hands gripped something tightly. A hunting rifle. "Jesus Christ, Liam," I hissed. "What the fuck are you doing?" He didn't answer, just kept staring, his breathing slow and steady, as if he hadn't even heard me. "You know I hate that thing," I muttered, glancing towards the window he was fixated on. It faced the garden, but in the faint moonlight, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the usual trees swaying gently in the breeze. I turned back to him, grabbing the gun and trying to pull it from his hands. He didn't move, not even flinch. His grip was iron, yet his body looked as relaxed as ever. I tugged again, harder this time, bracing myself to wrench it free. Still, Liam didn't budge. He didn't even seem like he was making an effort to hold onto the gun, more like he was frozen in place. "Well, I believe you now," I sighed, releasing my hold on the rifle. "But I wish you'd stop acting like this. Just tell me what's wrong." Still, he didn't speak. No reaction. Not even a flicker of emotion. His breathing remained steady, unnervingly so. I took hold of his shoulders and shook him, but it was like trying to move a statue. Panic began to rise within me. "Liam?" I said, now genuinely worried. Nothing. As I looked closer, I realized something was horribly wrong. He wasn't blinking. I pressed a finger to his eye, gingerly touching the wet surface. His eye didn't so much as twitch. He didn't blink, didn't react. I stepped back, my hand flying to cover my mouth in shock. Liam's body was here, but it was like he wasn't. He was frozen in place, staring ahead, completely unresponsive, like he was trapped in some comatose state, awake but not truly conscious. Collapsing into the chair across from him, my mind raced. Is this what he had been experiencing? Every night? Trapped in this strange, frozen place where nothing worked and no one could move? He had said it felt like hours. Oddly, that thought brought me some comfort. I could just wait it out. Eventually, it would end. I just had to wait. So I sat there, trying to relax, hoping that sleep would take me. But sleep didn't come. No matter how much I tried to calm my mind, I remained wide awake, hyper-aware of everything around me. Time crawled. Minutes felt like hours. Occasionally, I whispered his name, hoping for any sign of life. But Liam remained as still as ever. As I sat there in the dark, cold and exhausted, another thought began to creep in. Liam had seen someone outside. What if he wasn't wrong? What if someone was still out there, watching us? A chill ran down my spine. My eyes darted toward the windows, the ones I had tried so hard to avoid. Each one suddenly seemed like a black portal, hiding something, or someone, just beyond my view. Whoever was out there, they had terrified my husband to the point of breaking. I drew my knees up to my chest, hugging them for warmth, though it did little to stop the goosebumps prickling across my skin. I wished Liam would say something. Anything. But he just kept staring, fixated on the window behind me. His gaze unnerved me, making me turn my head every few minutes to check. The longer I sat there, the more desperate my glances became. What if I wasn't alone in this dark room? What if something was just outside, watching us? How long had I been sitting here? 4 hours? 5? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. I needed to move, to shake off the cold and the fear. Standing up, I stretched my legs and walked cautiously toward the window Liam had been staring at. I peered out into the dark garden. The trees swayed gently, the leaves rustling in the breeze, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to me like a heavy shadow. The windows felt too exposed, too vulnerable. I shivered, instinctively stepping back, feeling like a pair of unseen eyes were following my every move. I turned back to Liam, my heart heavy with dread. His body was still there, unmoving, locked in that eerie, unblinking stare, exposed. I crept along the walls, my body pressed against them as I moved, keeping my face hidden except for the barest glimpse I allowed around the window frame. Outside, the street looked as cold and deserted as I felt. My eyes roamed over the cars and houses, but with no streetlights, everything blended into an oppressive darkness. The night swallowed up the details, black shadows melting into the black sky, the edges of the houses barely distinguishable. And then, I saw them. 2 small pinpricks of light, barely visible, like distant stars, but low to the ground. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, wondering if it was an animal. The lights were spaced close enough to be eyes, and just above them, faint, jagged shapes hinted at something that resembled antlers. I leaned in, straining on tiptoe to get a better view, but the rest of the figure was obscured by a parked car. When I shifted for a better look, my breath caught in my throat. A man's body. Standing perfectly still, hidden in the night, just staring. A scream bubbled up inside me, escaping my lips before I could stop it. The figure's head turned sharply in response, antlers swaying in the dark. The faint pinprick eyes exploded into twin beams of intense light, blinding me. I gasped, stumbling backward, throwing myself out of view. Pure white light flooded the room, illuminating everything, including Liam, still seated on the sofa, clutching his gun, motionless. The light moved with purpose, searching, and I ran. I bolted toward the doorway, barely staying ahead of the brilliant illumination that chased me, painting my shadow on the walls as I fled. I rounded the corner and nearly slipped on the kitchen tiles. My mind raced. Liam's grip on the gun had been too strong, but I knew he kept the crowbar upstairs. I sprinted up the stairs, heart pounding, the twin beams of light following me. As I passed the hall window, the blinding light crept around the edges of the curtain, tracking me. Even with the curtains drawn, whatever was out there knew exactly where I was. I reached the bedroom and flung the door open, desperate for the crowbar, anything to defend myself. My eyes locked onto the only light in the room, crimson numbers glowing from the alarm clock. 3:33 a.m. Behind me, light spilled across the floor, casting my shadow as I collapsed to the ground. I curled up, too terrified to scream, expecting to see the figure with antlers and headlamp eyes towering over me. But it was only the hall light. The power had come back. The water in the bathroom was rushing, and I could hear the familiar hum of the house returning to life. I glanced back at the alarm clock. It read 3:34 a.m. now, as if mocking me. I don't know how long I lay there, face pressed into the carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. My throat ached from the gut-wrenching cries. I didn't dare look at the clock again. The lights were back. I was safe. For now. Lucy found me not long after. Her presence snapped me out of my hysteria, maternal instincts kicking in. I forced myself up, wiping away my tears, and scooped her into my arms. I took her back to her room, wrapped her in blankets, and then sat by her bedside in a chair until sleep finally overtook me. The next day, I was still in shock, my eyes wide and vacant. I turned to Liam, trembling. "I believe you," I whispered. "I was there. 3:33 a.m. Everything was off. Even you." My voice cracked, and I broke down again. Liam just held me as I shook in his arms. I didn't tell him about the deer-headed figure or the lights. I didn't need to. I knew he'd seen it too. We both called in sick, and I didn't protest when Liam installed window grills or when he brought the hunting rifle into our bedroom. He set it up against the wall, and that night, we lay awake, side by side, staring at the ceiling in silence, waiting. At 3:30 a.m., Liam sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. He began dressing, and when I asked what he was doing, he sighed. "If you got trapped there, that means Lucy might one day too," he said quietly, picking up the rifle and laying it across his lap. "If that happens, I can't protect either of you." I struggled to speak, my throat tightening with fear. What are you saying? What are you going to do?" "I've been sitting here, night after night, and he just keeps getting closer." Liam's voice was steady but filled with dread. "The windows rattle so hard, Marie, I feel like the whole house is going to come apart. I've heard the doors straining, heard something climbing down the chimney, scratching at the walls. I can't keep waiting. It's me he wants." "Liam, please. I've got to end this," he said, cutting me off, his voice trembling with resolve. "I can't just sit here any longer." I opened my mouth to protest again, but the faint ticking of the alarm clock silenced us both. Our heads turned in unison toward it. 3:33 a.m. I stared at those red numbers as they flickered. 3:34 a.m. I turned back to Liam, only to find him gone. In his place, a note rested on the bed. "I have to find out, Marie. Have to end it. Can't go on like this. I still love you, even if you don't love me back. Look after Lucy. If you wake up at 3:33 a.m., don't look outside." I crumpled the note in my fist and ran through the house, panic rising in my chest. "Liam," I yelled, my voice trembling. "Liam, I saw him too." But the house echoed back my words, empty and cold. He was gone. The front door was wide open, letting in the chill of the night. His car still sat in the driveway. His clothes were hanging untouched in the wardrobe. The only thing he'd taken was his gun. The next day passed in a daze, an exhausting blur of police calls, tearful conversations with family, and hours of waiting. But no matter how chaotic it got, one thing was always in the back of my mind. The clocks, creeping second by second towards that dreaded time. 3:33 a.m. The moment I now feared more than anything. Well, almost anything. Liam had been right. I had to protect Lucy. I couldn't let her experience that place, that terror. I wouldn't. So I tucked her into bed that night, kissed her forehead, and waited. Despite my anxiety, exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted off. But when I woke, the darkness told me everything I needed to know. I didn't need to check the clock. I knew exactly what time it was. Outside, the wind howled, slamming a loose garden gate open and shut in a relentless rhythm. I pulled the sheets tighter around me, my mind racing with memories of what Liam had said, about rattling windows and something trying to crawl down the chimney. I fought to push those thoughts away, to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping over me. But then, I noticed a faint glow behind the curtains. Relief washed over me momentarily. The streetlights were still on. I reached for my phone, but it wouldn't turn on, the screen as lifeless as the house around me. And that's when it hit me. Our streetlights cast an orange glow. This light wasn't orange. It was pure white, cold, and perfect. My stomach dropped. I knew, without needing to look, what was casting that light. But something inside me, curiosity, or maybe a terrible helplessness, drove me to peek behind the curtain. What I saw froze me to the spot. A deer's skull, mounted on a decaying, rotting body, gazed up at me with glowing, headlamp eyes. The creature didn't walk. It drifted, gliding toward me, its antlers swaying in the wind as if it were part of the night itself, moving as slow and inevitable as death. But even as my gaze locked onto that grotesque figure, I barely noticed it. My eyes had fallen on the second figure, a man standing nearby, holding a hunting rifle. I recognized his height, his build. It was Liam, but his eyes were gone, replaced by black, sunken pits with only faint pinpricks of light deep within, like distant stars. He stood motionless for a moment, then his head jerked unnaturally, snapping toward me. Those black pits swelled, erupting into twin beams of blinding light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, like the high beams of a car, like a lighthouse cutting through the night, like a spotlight on a darkened stage. The light seared into my eyes, burning them, but I couldn't pull away. I was trapped, paralyzed, staring into those empty, hollow sockets that had once belonged to my husband. Liam raised the rifle, pointed it directly at me. Tick. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The light vanished. The street outside was back to normal, bathed in its familiar orange haze. The wind had died down to a soft murmur. The figures, Liam and that thing, were gone. I glanced at the clock. 3:34 a.m. That was last night. The police have a guard posted outside now. They think I'm worried about Liam coming back. And I suppose I am in a way. But no amount of guards will help. They could post 1,000 officers around the house, and it wouldn't matter. None of them will be awake at 3:33 a.m. I know now that this won't stop. I've seen that thing outside and I can feel it. Each night it's getting closer. Each night its presence grows stronger. Liam didn't slow it down. He just gave it a way in.